Last week we addressed the question of who were the Boers, and this week it is the turn of the British Army. How well equipped were they, and how well prepared were they to meet a modern enemy like the Boers in 1899? My name is Ron Gold, and during this period of lockdown I'm going to be making a series of short videos, and this one on the British Army is the second of those. The series will culminate in the South African War, and in particular the Battle of Speenkop, which is not far from where I'm sitting at the moment. The early part of the 19th century was successful for Britain. She was fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, and that all came to an end, the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815. She was on top of her game. She was well led. She was confident. But what went wrong? By 1899, the British Army that landed here to fight the Boers struggled. Well, let's look at the problems the British had under four headings. The first was experience. An army, much like a sporting team, needs to compete against the best if it is to expose its own weaknesses and be successful. And although there were no fewer than 56 wars in Europe during the 19th century, Britain was only involved in one of them, the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. And the soldier who fought in that war had moved on, retired, died by the time the army arrives in 1899. So that British Army is woefully short of experience. The second is technology. There were major technological advances during the 19th century in the military sphere. Let's look at one or two of those. The first was firearms. The smoothbore muzzle-loading muskets that were used at Waterloo, slow to load, relatively accurate at 30 to 40 yards, they'd given way to breech-loading rifles. And these rifles had killing ranges of up to 2,000 yards, relatively accurate at 1,000 yards. The British Army tended to still be using tactics more aligned with muskets than with rifles. Artillery had improved. Napoleon had shown the world that artillery was the way to win battles. But Napoleon's guns had ranges of 1,500, 1,800 meters perhaps, firing solid ball and crude exploding shells. By 1899, some field guns had ranges of in excess of 6 kilometers, fired a range of projectiles, some of which were airburst. The next thing is strategy and tactics. The Military Academy of Sandhurst had come into being in the early part of the 19th century, but it rather seems that their focus in those early days was more on ceremonial, on the parade ground, on the deportment of the officers, than it was on strategy and tactics. It's a fact that the first war games in the UK took place the year before the South African War in 1898, and the senior general did not distinguish himself in those war games. And lastly, let's look at the enemy that the British were to face in South Africa. Firstly, the Zulus. The Zulus, under their warlord Shaka in the 1820s, had developed into probably the most formidable indigenous army in Africa. And by 1879, that army was at its best, at its strongest. And although the British invasion of Zululand in January 1879 would result in victory, it was an expensive victory. And there were several serious defeats, in particular that at Isandlwana on the way to that victory. Only 18 months later, the British would take on the Boers for the first time in the Transvaal War of Independence, or the First Boer War. It was a small war, sure, but in each of the four battles, Britain was humiliated and defeated. In the Battle of Majuba, the final battle in that war, the British would suffer 65% casualties for the loss of 2 Boer dead. And the Secretary for War, the Duke of Cambridge, would call it the most humiliating rout in the long annals of British military history. But Majuba did the British a favor. Majuba exposed the weaknesses, and a reform program began. Well, I should rather say it continued. There had been attempts at reform, but now, after Majuba, it all changed. All the gaily colored uniforms disappeared. No more red coats, no more white helmets. No more bands playing as the men marched to war. No more doomed colour parties carrying flags onto the battlefield. All would be dressed in drab khaki. They came into the war to fight the Boers with one of the most efficient rifles in the world at that time, the .303 Lee Metford and Lee Enfield. New artillery made its appearance. The problem with that new army, and it was arguably the most modern and the most well-equipped in the world, is there was one piece of that army that had been neglected, that had not been updated. And this was the piece between the ears of the generals. Next week, we're going to look at the events leading up to the war and the causes of the war.